Hello, my name is Anne McManus, and this is Government Unlocked. Have you ever sat down to watch the evening news or looked at your social media only to feel totally overwhelmed by the flurry of terms about debates and decisions swirling around our government? I know I have as a citizen. I've found myself inundated with the headlines about the Constitution, talks about our budget, political battles over certain policy decisions, and things that really shape the very fabric of our daily lives. Despite being surrounded by an enormous amount of information, I realized that understanding the true inner workings of our republic is no simple task. That's why we created Government Unlocked, a show for curious minds and concerned citizens alike. Whether you've always wanted to brush up on the basics or you're simply trying to make sense of the latest controversy, this show is designed for you. Our mission is simple: to open the doors to the complex world of our government, demystifying processes, priorities, and foundational principles that govern us all. Let's face it, government is intimidating. The language is dense, the processes are at times confusing, and the stakes are very high. But behind all of this, there are people involved. There are things that are happening that impact people who work for federal agencies, but also impact our daily lives. In Government Unlocked, we aim to bridge the gap between the headlines and the heart of the matter, providing clarity as much as we can where confusion exists. As I began my personal journey to understand the mechanics of government, I realized how much was left unsaid in mainstream conversation. What does the Constitution actually say? And how does it affect our rights and responsibilities today? What role does a citizen truly play in a republic that is, in theory, by and for the people? At the core of each episode is a respect for the foundational principles of our republic. We'll explore the historical context behind the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, tracing how these documents have shaped and continue to shape our national lives. I feel very fortunate today to have Jane Scarborough with us. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jane. She's an amazing woman. She started her undergraduate education at Rice University, and she really studied American history right from the very beginning. She went on to get a PhD degree in constitutional history, so we've got a real expert here. Jane then entered the field of education, where I'm sure she was a valued teacher to all of her students, because I certainly have learned a lot in the short time I've gotten to know Jane. And of course, that's not enough. Jane had to go back to school at the age of 40 and become an attorney. And she worked for a short period of time for a commercial law firm, but her heart truly is in education. And she ended up at Northeastern University, where she was an associate dean and then went on to be a vice president at the university. But her heart was always back in the classroom, and after, I think, negotiations with the president of the university, she ended up back where where her heart was, in the classroom. Since then, Jane has been a real advocate for helping you and I understand our Constitution. She provides classes over in Falmouth, and from what I understand, it's a full house. So welcome, Jane. Thank you so much for being here with us today. So let's talk about the Constitution.
Thank you, Anne. It is correct that so many people talk about the Constitution without really knowing what they are talking about. Since we don't teach civics and haven't for so long, it's amazing how little people do understand about it. So I think this series will be important, and I'm glad that you're offering it. The major issue at the Constitutional Convention was really how much power to give a national government and how much should the states retain. Because remember, the states had been sovereign for a while before the Constitution. It was Actually, there's a famous story, Ben Franklin's story, that probably is apocryphal, although it's been studied and debated, and they finally found a source of the story in a journal by James McHenry, who was a Maryland member of the Constitutional Convention. He kept a journal, and in that journal he repeats this story, and they finally found this, and they now have it in the Library of Congress, so the argument is over as to whether this really happened, unless James McHenry thought it up. This is the story he tells, that Ben Franklin was leaving the Constitutional Convention on the last day, and he was stopped outside by a woman who asked him whether or not, well, doctor, she said, what do we have, a monarchy or a republic? And his answer, which has become famous, is, well, we have a republic if you can keep it. Now that story and that line has been a line that has been answered and written about and talked about most recently by Senator Amy Klobuchar after the January 6th rioting at the Capitol, to remind people what's at stake and what was in danger. So if you think about it, what we need to talk about is the framers gave us a republic. We often say we have a democracy. We do have a democracy, but it isn't like the city-states in Greek, where it was a direct democracy. People voted directly, and that was the result. Here we have a representative democracy, which is really what a republic is about. The choice of a republic was a compromise. Whether or not, again, how much independence did you want to give to the states and still have an effective national government? And
there was a lot of controversy around that.
Well, there was, because again, there was a fear of a strong national government, because having been under the king,
sure,
and they didn't want to.
They didn't want to go back to that.
Right, they didn't want to go back to what they had fought so much for to get out from under. The basic principle of federalism is reflected in the 10th Amendment. Remember, the last of the amendments that we refer to, are the last 10, are the Bill of Rights. They didn't call them that at the time, but they are now. And the 10th Amendment, which is the last of the Bill of Rights amendments, states the following: the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively and to the people. Now let me say that in plain language.
Thanks, Jane.
The Constitution delegates or gives the federal government certain enumerated, that means listed, rights or powers. Enumerated powers are an important part of a federalist system because there's going to be a division of powers. So what are they? While at the same time it gives the states such rights or powers that are not specifically prohibited to them by the Constitution.
So if it wasn't covered by the Constitution, the states had the rights.
Well, as long as it may be covered in it, it may prohibit the states.
Right. Okay.
But otherwise, what's left, what is often referred to as reserve powers, or constitutional guru, as far as I'm concerned, Larry Tribe calls it the residue powers. Those are left then for the states, respectively, as it says, or to the people. Now, the reason it includes the people is under the Constitution, there are some things that the states can generate, for example, generate an amendment, initiate an amendment. And there's also a provision that allows people to initiate an amendment. So it's beyond what the states aren't doing what you want them to do. The people have a right under the Constitution to initiate that.
Can you give us an example of that, where the people put forth an amendment?
Well, there have been hundreds and hundreds of amendments, mostly
something famous.
Well, the fact is that the people initiating an amendment hasn't actually happened. that way. The way it has happened is there's been pressure on representatives to initiate something. One is very close to being initiated by people, and it's one about the balanced budget. And a number of states, through their representatives, have said they want to have an amendment that requires the federal government to have a balanced budget. They don't have quite enough states yet, but it's close. That's the closest example I can give to you, because, again, like so many things in the Constitution, it's there as a fallback for the people. If your elected officials aren't doing...
If it isn't working.
If it isn't working, and if you don't think they're representing you, if there are enough of you, you have a way to bypass the legislation.
Okay.
So federalism is a political system in which power is constitutionally divided between a central or national or federal government and a regional, state, or provincial government. Each level of government has its own set of powers and responsibilities, and both operate directly upon the people. Another way of envisioning federalism is to think of it as a two-tiered system. First tier is the national or federal government, which handles matters of national importance, like defense, currency, foreign policy. The second tier is the state or provincial governments, and in that case even local governments. They manage regional or local issues like education, local law enforcement, public health. So what you have is a series, these two tiers, the federal government, the state government, and then there's this concurrent overlapping where both of them have a power and they share it. The first, most obvious example of that is taxes. Both the federal and the state have the power to tax the people. We're all aware of that. The other issue then is that is important in a republic is when you look at who is the source of the powers that are given to the federal government under this republic. And the sources are the people, not the states. And it was to the people that the government was accountable. To the people that the government was accountable. I want to repeat that today. The fact was made clear when it came to the ratification process of the Constitution, because it was ratified by popular vote, popular referendum. Now, that didn't mean that women and slaves had a chance to vote, but it did mean that a number of men who could not vote locally or in the state because they didn't own property or because they weren't the right religion, was actually also true in a number of states, they were allowed to vote. It was a much broader referendum. And it was a people who chose what the state was going to do, whether the state as a whole, as a result of the vote of the people, ratified the Constitution. So again, it underscores that the people are the ones that ultimately decided that, yes, this is a government that we want. This is the republic we want, if we can keep it.
How did we get there, though, Jane? I mean, how did we get to that point where we decided we needed something different? We needed a constitution.
Well, that's an important question, because our first national government was established under the Articles of Confederation. And that was a document that was ratified in all 13 states in 1781. So in 1781, we're still in the middle of the Revolutionary War. It set up a very different significantly weaker national government than was adopted 7 years later with the ratification of the Constitution. So it was called the Articles of Confederation because a confederation is a loose organization of what really remain as sovereign entities. So under the Articles of Confederation, the states were still sovereign, and that was one of the problems. They didn't really have, under the Articles of Confederation, the government didn't have any power, really. They didn't have an executive. They had a rotating executive through the Congress. They couldn't really require the states to pay any money. that became a huge issue because the payment of the soldiers during the Revolutionary War, they could just ask the states to help pay. So
they found it onerous and it was hard to get work done.
Absolutely. There was no power to tax. There was no authority to regulate commerce. There was no executive branch other than within the Congress, no judiciary. Major laws required 9 of the 13 states. Amendments required unanimous vote. Even the adoption of the Articles required unanimous vote of all 13 states.
As you describe that, though, it sounds almost impossible that they could get their act together enough to get to a constitution. How did that happen?
Well, it became clear that there was not the sufficient power that they needed. It was clear it wasn't working. So there was a convention called in 1786, and it was called the Annapolis Convention because it was held in Annapolis. And it was attended by only 12 people representing 5 states. They called for it, but nobody came. And the purpose of that convention was to address trade and commerce issues, because what you had is the states competing against each other, penalizing each other if they wanted to trade or to have commerce in
So
the
acting
state.
like little countries.
Yes, because again, under the Articles of Confederation, they really were sovereign. Okay. They just agreed to all get together for these kind of other purposes, but they weren't the purposes that are really necessary to run a government.
But they had to get together to fight the war.
They did, and that was in a way almost separate. I mean, Washington is getting a lot more and should get a lot more credit than probably was given. We kind of take him for granted, father of our country, but he really was running the war. And again, states were paying their regiments, but then after a while that they weren't keeping up with it, and the national government under the Articles didn't have the authority to tax them to get the money. The delegates that came to Annapolis quickly realized that the problems of interstate commerce were tied to the broader issues, which led directly to the call for a new convention. And that convention had a mandate to address and not just trade, but all defects of the federal government. This recommendation led to the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. Now, it's interesting that that convention did not have a mandate to throw out the Articles the Articles
of Confederation,
but they had a mandate to look at the problems and deal with those. So very soon it was apparent that the Articles didn't deal with them at all. So it's interesting because we have a history. If you call a convention, our only history is they don't do what they were supposed to do when they came there. They threw it all out and started all over.
That's if they turn up.
Well, they did ultimately turn up for that, but yes, they didn't in Annapolis. And it's one of the fears, you know, today there's a lot of talk, should we have a new convention? Do we need to redo the Constitution, or do we need a whole new Constitution? And the worry of those of us who study this area is that the only model they have would be that they will come together, throw it all out, and start from scratch. And that's a little scary these days.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree.
At any rate, the significance of the Annapolis Convention is widely regarded as the turning point in American history because it marked the transition from efforts to amend the Articles of Confederation to the movement of a new constitution and a strong national government.
So it was actually the Annapolis Convention that called the Philadelphia Convention.
Yes, it is.
And how did they compel folks to come to it, since only 5, were they from Massachusetts, some of the 5 that showed up in Annapolis?
You know, I don't know. They certainly had very important representation at the Constitutional Convention.
Okay.
But I'm not sure about
I'm sure
Annapolis.
they were.
I'm sure they were. Massachusetts is always in there. So that call for the Philadelphia Convention was actually purportedly written by Alexander Hamilton, who was there. So again, this was a turning point. And did they show up is an interesting question, because it wasn't clear after the Annapolis Convention that they were going to show up.
Yeah.
There were two key people that had to show up. One was Washington.
Of course.
And Washington had gone back. He didn't really want to come and get into politics again. After he gave up his uniform, he went to the Congress under the Articles of Confederation and surrendered his uniform, his military. He could have done anything. He just wanted to go home. So he wasn't real keen on coming to this, but he was being pressured by Alexander Hamilton and Madison, and he did reluctantly finally agree to come. The other one was Ben Franklin, and it was felt that if Washington and Franklin came, that would indicate how important
You
this
needed
was.
to be there if they were there.
Yes, they were important people, and something was going to happen if they were there. And of course, Washington became the president of the Constitutional Convention. And you know, he never said anything. He never entered into any of the discussions because he felt the president's role was not to give an opinion about anything. And he never did until the very final day, and there were still some holdouts who remained holdouts who did not sign the Constitution. And he made, at the very end, he made a speech in saying that he had found at his age that his opinion often changed over time, that maybe one should listen to other people and maybe weren't always right. It didn't really accomplish ultimately what he would have hoped, which would have been everyone signed. But again, sufficient number signed that it went into effect and went out to the states, to the states under the Articles of Confederation for ratification.
Can you talk a little bit about the structure? I mean, this didn't happen overnight. I'm sure there were lots of suggestions made to change the document. How did the process work, and then how did the structure of this ultimately develop?
Well, you know, we don't have a lot of historical evidence of what went on in the Constitutional Convention.
You mean Hamilton isn't telling the whole story?
Well, no, Hamilton.
I meant the play.
Yeah. Oh, you mean the play? You know, I haven't seen the play.
Jane.
I know the music from it, but I haven't seen the play. Hamilton probably told a lot of the story, but a little bit of artistic license. First of all, the convention was secret. It was a horribly hot summer in Philadelphia in 1787, but they had all the blinds down so that no one could see what was going on.
Why was that?
Because they felt that people would start to criticize or start to try to influence what was going on. And can you imagine today having a constitutional convention and it being secret, no leaks, everything, no television, no phones, but they pulled it off. It really was secret. Nobody really knew what was going on, which is one of the reasons for the apocryphal story about Ben Franklin. What do we have?
So we had the Confederation, and then secretly this meeting of key members of all the states gathered, and no one knew.
Well, no, people knew they were there, and why they were there. Of course, why they were there was to work on the Articles of Confederation. But people knew it was happening, but no one knew what was going on. They really did, even though it was incredibly hot, keep the place closed down. They had, actually, several people came with a plan. Madison came with a plan, the so-called Virginia plan. There was a New Jersey plan, so there were kind of outlines of what they could build on. The idea that they should start all over was accomplished or decided almost immediately, because it was just obvious that there was not enough power in this national government.
And there was consensus around that, for the most part.
Yes, yes, there was. When I say we don't have a lot of evidence about what went on, the only real consistent evidence we have is really the notes, the federal notes that Madison, his notes from the convention are the best thing, the only thing really consistently that we have of what went on. They divided up into various committees. They had a committee in the end, which was called the Committee on Style. And that committee actually did a lot of changing to make things kind of transition and to make things clearer.
So how it was written?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The things that were most contentious, you can imagine that there were the things that you would expect in a meta fashion. The most contentious or the most difficult thing was, again, this question of how much power between the federal and the states. But implicit in that was the whole slavery issue.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of dissension over how you amend the Constitution. There was a lot of discussion, and when I say dissension, I mean discussion or debate. We don't really know exactly how it was weighted, but there was just a lot of discussion about various issues that had come up, mostly taking off from what wasn't in the Articles of Confederation. So the discussion of Article 1, when you look at the Constitution, its structure kind of tells you everything from my point of view. It begins with a preamble, which we will talk about.
Yeah.
But then when you look at it, Article 1 is the legislature, it's Congress. And there's a reason for that, because that's the closest to the people. So Article 1 was thought to be the most important article. It's the longest article. The second article is the executive, and the third is the judiciary. I've already said the executive was very thin. They didn't have a lot in there because everyone agreed that Washington was going to be the first president. He was there presiding over the Constitutional Convention. So people were a little timid about talking about what powers
or what limitations
he was going to have. And so it was very slim, the discussion of the president.
And does it make sense that the discussion around Congress was beefier, if you will, because of Confederation? They had more experience with that kind of segment of government?
I'm sure that that's true.
Because how was judiciary handled during Confederation? By each state?
There wasn't a judiciary. It was just within the states.
Right.
So it wasn't a national one.
They had their own system of governing.
Yeah.
Okay.
The structure of the Constitution itself tells you a great deal about what the underlying values are behind it. The preamble, which is telling you exactly what the founders felt the purpose of this document was going to serve, and we will talk about that next time. The structure itself, the fact that the first article is the largest article, the most complete article, and that's the article that deals with the legislature, the Congress. And that's because the Congress is closest to the people. And that, too, was very important as an underlying fact of a republic. The government is accountable to the people. So you begin with that Congress is most representative of the people. The second article was the executive, and the executive is a very thin article because Washington was presiding over the convention, and it was a little difficult.
And who would tell him what to do?
Right, exactly. It was a little difficult to talk about how you might want to limit his powers, and so not much was said in that Article 2. The most important thing that's said, we'll talk about this a little later, was the first sentence of Article 2, which basically says the executive power is vested in a president of the United States, meaning the executive department is vested in that power in a president, one person. That has become an issue.
Yes, because I suspect there's ways to interpret that one way or the other.
Right, because when they wrote that, the executive department was almost non-existent.
Right.
It was a president.
And it was relying on a specific person at that point in time.
Yes.
Even though it was meant to last the test of time.
Right. But they weren't going to talk about it a lot with him sitting there presiding. And the third article is the judiciary, and that too is fairly thin. So what I'd like to do next time is to go beyond what the structure looks like and talk about what it actually says. What the preamble says is the purpose of this Constitution and how we should understand the underlying values behind it, and then talk about the articles themselves.
Because it truly is our driver's manual, isn't it?
It is. And it's so important that people have an understanding of it. It doesn't have to be, an academic understanding, but they need to know that they are the ones the government has to answer to. And the Constitution, the founders, that was the very intention, and you can see it throughout the Constitution itself.
Jane, this was a great start for us. I know personally I'm learning a lot. It's refreshing some things I did learn a long time ago, but it's also giving me a different perspective as an adult, looking back and seeing how important the Constitution is to what happens today in our own lives. And I know at our next show, we're going to go into greater detail. We're going to talk about the preamble and the various amendments that really guide us in our governance today. And I want to thank you, Jane, for being here. This is Government Unlocked. I hope you found this informative and inspiring. Thank you.